Just a quick reminder, please speak a little bit louder to be useful for the court. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I'll keep that in mind.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Go ahead, Shayan. Sorry.
Thank you. Let me introduce briefly our think tank and the project we are working on. In the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful, I am Shayan Afrasiabi, researcher of the International Department at the Governance and Policy Think Tanks, affiliated with Sharif University of Technology, the best Iranian university according to international rankings. Our think tank has different departments, conduct different research in various areas, including economy, media, regulations, and of course international relations. In this department, we are working on a project titled Predicting the Unpredictable, and is focusing on what will be the consequences of the possible Donald Trump's re-election as the US president. We are discussing with different distinguished experts around the world. And for the second session, we have the honor to host Dr. Vivek Mishra, research fellow at Observer Research Foundation, ORF, in India. Dr. Mishra is also a visiting faculty at Flame University. He was the Fulbright Nehru Doctoral Research Scholar at Columbia University, and also a former research fellow at the ICWA. Let me start the session with some general questions regarding the topic we are discussing today. The first and most important question is there any genuine difference between Trump and Biden according to Indian view? Naturally, it entails the question that how was India-US relations during the first Trump administration, and do you think that Trump will continue his some controversial policies he has and he pursuing the second is in his first term if he will be re-elected? Uh, in addition, do you think that will Trump strengthen Indo-American alliance to counter China as he did in the first term by reviving the Quad alliance and Quad multilateral dialogue? And or you think that he will be more disengage? He will disengage from his from U.S. Asian allies, the same as he are going to disengage from NATO allies. Uh, Another question is: should India be concerned about the second term of Trump administration, and why? Also, do you think that Trump will continue the unilateral or isolationist policies in his second term? And finally, how will Trump, do you think, address the transnational challenges like climate change, terrorism, financial crisis, and so on? The floor is yours, Dr. Mishra. We are listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Afriaspi, and thank you everyone else who's in the audience for inviting me to this privileged think tank. Really honored to be here. And it's also important for me from the sense of my subject expertise, which is the United States. So I follow this very closely. So let me start with your first question, sort of to set the scene in terms of what's happening in America vis-a-vis the Donald Trump presidency, and how Indians, particularly both the Indian citizen, and there is a distinction, there could be a distinction between Indian citizens and the Indian government, and how they perceive this possible election going in which direction in the US. Having said that, I mean, we might be in the middle of an election ourselves. India is going through an election. It's a long election, month and a half. So it is an important perspective to sort of conjoin what's happening in the United States with what's happening in India. Now, your first question on is there any difference between Biden's and Trump's respective policies towards India, and how does that vision where does that vision sit? I think ideally, if you look at the Trump presidency, there's been a stark difference in terms of how the policies were followed after the Obama administration. So, starting from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, we see a stark difference, because in all circumstances, the Democratic administration under President Obama, was also very different from the Democratic president of Biden, and I'll come to that later. But we see Trump coming to office on the cusp of a major change that he wishes to bring in the American society, and his promises are from climate change to immigration, which is like one of the main tenets of his domestic policy. In his first term, you would see that Trump promised the Mexican wall, which he has tempered down. The narrative around which has been tempered, given the realities that Trump faces today. Of course, he's been cornering the Democratic government of Biden on the issue of immigration, primarily because Biden is seen and criticized by the Democrats as a government that is open borders, right? It has allowed more immigrants to come in. And according to one figure, 7.2 million, which is 72 lakhs in Indian terminologies, people having crossed into the United States from the southern borders. Now, that's almost thousands of immigrants every day. That's the reality that America faces today, and that's what the Trump administration is hell-bent on capitalizing on, vis-a-vis the Biden administration. So you see a stark difference between Obama and Trump, because Trump harps on the idea of anti-immigration, and also anti-Islam in many ways, because Trump comes to office and he bans 7 specific Muslim countries. He imposes travel ban, which was later, of course, revoked by the Biden administration. So I think you see an anti-immigration, anti-outsider sentiment with concretizing within the Trump administration, and therefore, when the Biden administration comes to office, you see a stark difference. Now, in terms of India and how the respective policies between the Biden and the Trump administration sit with New Delhi's perspective. I think one of the issues here is the fact that when Trump comes to office, he doesn't distinguish between, let's say, China and India. He takes out a lot of angst against China, because he imposes a trade war with China by imposing a lot of tariffs. Excuse me. But with respect to India, also you see the Trump administration increasing tariffs. So particularly on the issue of Harley-Davidson, which is a famous motorcycle brand, India and the United States sat on opposite ends of the spectrum when Trump presidency was in office. And Trump was not willing to budge from a very high tariff. Essentially, if I were to buy a Harley Davidson motorcycle for 100 rupees during Trump presidency, my tariff would also be 100 or more than 100, which meant that a consumer in India would be paying as much tax as the price of the motorcycle, right? So it was doubly taxing for the Indian consumer, and in that sense, we really ran into a conflict with not really a conflict, but a disagreement on how tariffs should be imposed. But Trump administration, interestingly, did not distinguish between, let's say, a country like China or any other country. In case of China, his actions reverberated more simply because of the fact that US and China trade more than any other country. But on other issues, you see India, we saw that India and Trump aligned a lot. With respect to China, for instance, the alignment was almost missing because Trump administration was responsible for conducting one of the most number of exercises in the South China Sea against China, the freedom of navigation exercises. He was also responsible for bringing a trade war with China. So vis-a-vis China, he was very, very, very pursuant in terms of how he wants to contain China, or he wants to tackle China. Vis-a-vis India, I think trade and tariffs were the only issues. Apart from that, the Trump presidency had a successful India visit in which a lot of defense partnerships and defense agreements were signed. So I think when it comes to Trump, a difference between Trump and Biden administration, vis-a-vis the world, we have seen that vis-a-vis China, for instance, we've seen that Biden administration has doubled down on the tariffs that were imposed by the Trump presidency. So a Democratic president is breaking a trend from an earlier Democratic president, which was Obama, in imposing a Republican president's tariffs and policies on China, simply because China as a factor resonates in the United States much more today than it did in the past. And therefore, any government that you will see in Washington will bring China to the center of the table. For that matter, relations with India is on the opposite end. I mean, across the aisle, both the Republicans and the Democrats find India as a credible partner in the Indo-Pacific, which is a democracy, which is the world's fifth largest economy and soon to be fourth largest economy of the world, so a major market in that sense, and a credible Indo-Pacific strategic partner in this region to sort of maintain the regional power of balance vis-a-vis China. Although India doesn't look at the whole power balance game as a zero-sum game, but as an inclusive policy where countries should be part of. But I think in the United States conception of the Indo-Pacific strategy, balance of power is a critical element that sits here. So to sum up the first question, the answer to the first question is, how does the Trump and how will a prospective Trump presidency sit with New Delhi's interests? I think we would be India is not concerned that a Trump presidency could come in, but I think India, the best word here is cautious. I think all countries, not just India, are cautious and are preparing for the day when Trump presidency will take office, because his policies, as if you really go through the campaign speeches, will mark a difference in how he deals with the world, particularly in terms of economic benefits. It will have more influence and impact on America's allies and not so much on partners. And as you know, America distinguishes between allies, friends, and partners. So for instance, Japan and South Korea could face more repercussions if from a Trump presidency. For instance, if Trump decides to break the defense agreement and takes back the troop deployment in both these countries, which Trump administration in the first iteration of his presidency, he actually threatened both South Korea and Japan to pay for hosting the United States troops. So in terms of allies, you could see more pressure from a Trump presidency, but in terms of partners like India, I don't see too many avenues of pressure on this presidency. But on the issue of tariff and economic relations, I think we are going to have some disagreements. And because India and the US are not alien to disagreements, we've had issues at the WTO, for instance, on the solar panels. We've fought cases at the WTO. Which actually went in the favor of the United States. And the United States accused India of subsidizing solar panels, subsidizing local companies to make solar panels to the disadvantage of American companies. And we lost that case. So essentially, India should brace up for a turbulent or at least a cautious approach to economic relations with the United States, simply because the United States until last week was the largest trading partner of India. So I think the repercussions, which has just been overtaken by China this week. So it keeps fluctuating between the two largest powers. But the point that I want to underscore is that this balance of economic relations between India and the United States is going to be critical when a Trump presidency comes to power, simply because of the fact that the repercussions of economic relations now impinge on strategic partnerships, now impinge on trade relationships, and now impinge more importantly on climate change, human rights, and democracy. So I think on all of those issues, India will be cautious for a Trump presidency. For a Biden presidency, I think there is, of course, for a possible Biden presidency, there is a set of challenges or a set of interest-based cooperative agreements and issues that we already have on table that could change in the second term. So let me now shift gears and come to your second question on whether will a Trump presidency strengthen the Indo-American alliance to counter China as it revived the Quad in the first term. Now, it is true that the Trump presidency is more likely to, broaden and strengthen the Quad in many ways, and that you can see from the precedents that he set in his first term. Now, we should expect the Trump presidency to be more bellicose to China's demands and China's ways. For example, in the case of the Philippines, if you look at the Chinese state behavior and how China is cornering the Philippines every week, I think you will see in the case of the Biden administration, you're seeing a condemnation of that act. But in the case of President Trump's next term, and I think because a Trump presidency will always be sort of backed by the notion that this is going to be his last term, because American Constitution does not allow more than 2 terms. So the president will know that this is his last term, and that cuts 2 ways. The first of which is that he will be a lame duck president. Everybody will know the lame duck presidency is a term in the US which is used for a not so effective government, because that's the last term of the government and a change is imminent. The other way in which it could cut is that the Trump administration will carry out disruptive policies against China to strengthen the China factor in the United States. And that will also not just change the Republican Party's politics, but also hone the next generation of Republican parties. Because if you look at the Republican Party's leadership, there's hardly anybody who is below Trump who's having the kind of influence that Trump has on the Republican Party. There's hardly any leader. You can take names like Marco Rubio, Doug Burgum, But all of these leaders are not popular within the Republican Party, and if they are within their states. So I think the essential sort of aim on goal of the Trump presidency vis-a-vis China and the Quad will be to strengthen this alliance in a way that America, of course, leads that change, and most importantly, it affects the domestic politics in the United States in a way that it hones a sort of leadership layer within the Republican Party. Now, if you come to the India, Japan, Australia equation within the Quad and how a Trump presidency might sit with it, it also depends how this will unfold, how the Quad question will unfold. Also depends on the fact that whether a possible Trump presidency will go ahead with all the changes that the Biden administration has brought in its China policy, or will the Trump administration carve a new China policy? Now, that's the question that we will grapple with until we see the president acting in a certain way, the next president acting in a certain way. So what I mean by this is, ever since the Biden administration has come into office, they have doubled down on the set of China policies. For example, the trade war, Biden administration has doubled down on the trade tariffs, and China has been at the receiving end. China has also imposed retaliatory tariffs on the United States. So there's been a back and forth between the world's two largest powers, economies. Now, the question to my mind is whether Trump presidency will take back some of these tariffs or will impose additional tariffs. I don't expect the Trump presidency to take back these tariffs, and that will in another way strengthen the idea of the Quad, and all the four countries, all the four other three democracies that make the Quad will sort of strengthen in a way, because I'll come to the reasons later. But if the Trump presidency does take back some of the tariffs and tries to create a sort of amenable relationship with China, because mind you, Donald Trump presidency will be as unpredictable, and as your title correctly marks, predicting the unpredictable. So we may not be surprised if the Trump presidency is actually aiming for a mellowed down relationship with China, and sort of driving a détente, so to say. Because if you look at the policies right now in the last few months of the Biden administration, actually Washington is driving a détente, which means that Secretary Blinken has made several trips to China. Janet Yellen, who's the Trade Secretary of the United States, has made at least 2 visits to China to coax Beijing to make an amenable relationship, because United States is at a juncture where it does not want to start a third front. It is already dealing with wars at 2 fronts, one in the Middle East versus Israel versus Hamas, and the other in Europe, where Russia versus Ukraine. On both these fronts, the United States is at a back foot. And what do I mean when I say United States is at a back foot? In case of Israel, Hamas, you're seeing a growing rift between Israel and Washington. The Biden administration recently stopped the first tranche of ammunitions to go to Israel because it knows that it is going to be used in Rafah. On the second, and that has created a rift between the Netanyahu government and the Biden administration. And on the European front, you see Russia entering Kharkiv. Kharkiv was and continues to be among the most preeminent cities and symbolic cities of Ukraine. If it falls to Russia, once again you see the Biden administration on a back foot. So within these strains, And economically, this has meant a tremendous time for the Biden administration. Economically, it has meant that the Biden administration will have to support to Ukraine. The last bill that it sent to Ukraine was 95 billion, which was delayed for over 3 months because of a rift between the Democrats and the press and the Republicans, whether they should fund Ukraine. And they are on a back foot in the Middle East. So within that equation, they don't want China to be opening as a third front. Within that equation, if you bring in Trump, where does it sit? Now, Trump has been clear. He has said that vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine war, Trump will end the war in 1 day, in less than 24 hours. This is what he has said. What does he mean by that? He has basically meant that he will stop, or he will ask Europeans to do more in terms of NATO support, and otherwise he will ask Russia to do whatever they want, which means that he could weaken the transatlantic alliance. Now, I am of the opinion personally that he will not pull out of the alliance, but he will threaten the alliance by pulling off or delaying some of the funding in NATO if it becomes the next president. Vis-a-vis Israel, I think the Donald Trump presidency will have a completely different approach as compared to Ukraine. Vis-a-vis the Middle East, Donald Trump's presidency will try and drive a relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia, as you know, is already is trying to coax or is trying to urge the Biden administration to sign a defense agreement and give them a civilian nuclear use facility, which the Biden administration is, of course, not very keen to. For the Saudis, I think it works if this deal happens within a democratic setup in the United States. Because if a Trump presidency comes, I don't think the Trump administration will give any deal or, not in the least a nuclear agreement or a civil nuclear facility to Saudi Arabia, simply because of the past given relationship. The other aspect is that the unpredictability associated with Trump will have it that Jared Kushner, who is, of course, the son-in-law of Donald Trump, had a major role in driving what is called the Abraham Accords. So he has a very functional. The Trump administration has a very functional relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is very practical. So we'll have to wait and see on how that plays out, whether the I2U2 deal goes through and the Americans are part of it. So that's another equation. So coming back to my question on the Indo-American alliance to counter China, I think you will not see a direct alliance because India doesn't use that word. You could see a partnership to increase India's capability in the Indo-Pacific from a long-term perspective, so that India's net security provider role grows from the Gulf to the Far East. And I think we are already in that scene, right? Now, should India be concerned? I think I've already answered this question, whether a second term of Donald Trump's presidency will be good or bad. I think we should be cautious and not concerned, because I think India had a great relationship with the Trump presidency, and given the unpredictability of Trump will be tempered down and translate into predictability with India. Some of it, most of it, because of the given channels of negotiations that the two countries already have. Why? Because India and the US already are major defense partners, so there's already a very active, functional defense relationship between the two sides. India and the US already have major bilateral forums like the 2+2 dialogue. So regardless of which president takes office in Washington, I think there are certain channels of communication and certain channels of partnership which will continue. In terms of defense relationship, we should see a more hiked up partnership because we are trying to create a self-reliant defense industry inside India. And I think for all those purposes, we need technologies from the United States. But I think there will be some issues with, regardless of which presidency, that if it is Trump presidency, we are going to see a harder push from Washington on some of the steps that India takes on its own. For example, yesterday, the people from Ministry of External Affairs of India and Government of India flew to Iran to sign the Chabahar Agreement and take over the management in Iran. And I think it's important to note that it was under the American pressure that India sort of brought down the oil imports from Iran. But I think to the extent that India is trying to carve an independent outlook and has always been an independent actor in this region, we will try to establish relationship with actors and countries that we seen work for our interest. And I think Iran is one. The Chabahar port is a very important port from India's perspective in two ways. I think one, of course, for the factor that we are trying to create a international north-south transport corridor, which connects Mumbai port to St. Petersburg via Chabahar. And the second is, of course, our role in Central Asia in terms of how we look at the Central Asian region as as an extended neighborhood. I think for both these regions, our presence and our relationship with Iran continues to be important. And I think that is something that will be challenging for a future American president, because, of course, if Trump is in office, we will see more pressure from Washington in terms of how to deal with our relationships with Iran and other actors for that region, Russia. But I think given the stability of India-US relations and given the factors that are driving, if you look at the factors that are driving it is defense, and those are strong pillars, so they can't be removed or they can't be dislodged by one president or the other. So I think the drivers are so strong that these hiccups or bumps might aggravate or amplify under certain presidents and might temper down in certain presidents. For example, the Russia-Ukraine war, India's stance of buying oil from Russia despite the unhappiness of the West. Now, one of the reasons how we balanced that was the fact that the West understands that India is an independent actor in this region. And I think for that reason, and also, if you look at some of the interviews of US officials, particularly the US ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, only yesterday, he outlines that we wanted India to buy Russian oil, behind the curtains, because that stabilizes the oil prices all over the world. So there was a tacit interest for the United States. But for a Trump presidency, I'm not sure if that maturity of decision making or if that assessment of decision making will be the same. For example, in the case of Trump administration, you could see a more unpredictable move. For example, imposing more sanctions on Iran, or imposing further creating more roadblocks so that India is not able to sort of import oil or have a management role in Chabahar port and have a presence in the Chabahar port. Given the kind of conflict that is already going in West Asia, there could be a stark difference between the policies of Trump administration, a future Trump administration, and the current Biden administration. The Biden administration is reeling under tremendous pressure on its policies in Gaza. Right? The numbers have fallen. Trump is leading in 5 swing states in terms of polls, which means that at this point in time, Trump is more likely to become the president. And if that happens, the US policy towards the Middle East is going to shift. To my mind, and this is just a prediction, I could very well be wrong, but I think as I see it, Trump will deal with the Gaza problem, with the Israel problem in a completely different way. At home, he has already said that all all protesters will be deported. If they are students from different countries, they'll be deported. I wonder if that is really a practical or a pragmatic step, but I think he has hinted that he's not going to go easy on the pro-Palestinian protests, which is spreading all across the United States. So in terms of the Middle East, Trump's policies could be a more pro-Israel policy. We already saw the reflection of that when he shifted the embassy of the United States from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. You could see more fortified decision making in terms of how and whether in a future case scenario, whenever this war ends, how Gaza will be managed. I think if a Trump presidency comes to office, you could see a vast difference and a more engaged role together with Israel in the management of a future Middle East and future Gaza, a more closer relationship with Saudi Arabia and UAE in terms of managing a post-conflict Middle East. So I think these are some of the possibilities of a future of a second Trump presidency vis-a-vis his policies in India, as well as how it plays out in the Middle East. Now, finally, I mean, let me touch on some of the other questions that you've sent. Where will the IMEC go under Trump? Now, I mean, part of it I've already answered in my previous deliberations and the previous narratives, but I think IMEC, as you see, the Trump presidency will not be very keen on driving connectivity projects as the Biden administration is. And I think there are 2 or 3 reasons for that. The first is that the Middle East politics has sort of fractured any possibility of a connectivity project in the Middle East. But from some of the reports that we've all seen, Saudi Arabia is still keen to have a connectivity project and normalize relationship with Israel if Israel promises a 2-state solution for Gaza, 2-state solution for Palestine. Now, under the current administration, and if the Netanyahu cabinet in Israel, and if you double that down with a Trump presidency in Washington, I think the likelihood of a 2-state solution is further away. And I could very well be wrong here, but that's my presumption, because given the tendencies and given the policy tendencies of the Trump presidency, you are likely to see a more fortified sort of alliance between Israel and the United States, in which a future Trump presidency will harp on the idea of a connectivity, of better relationship with Israel. But the caveat here is that a Trump presidency will also be driving a cordial relationship with Saudi Arabia, because for one of the main reasons is that a Democratic president like Biden has a lot of qualms, against human rights, democracy, and so on and so forth. The Trump administration will be free of all these qualms. So, for example, the Khashoggi killing that happened, the Biden administration one of the reasons why Biden administration continues to deal with Saudi Arabia in a particular way, in a distanced way, is because they value ideas like democracy and human rights, and they believe that Saudi Arabia crossed a line when Jamal Khashoggi was killed. For the Trump administration, these are not issues. For the Trump administration, there are no moral qualms, no baggages, and therefore you will see a complete embrace of both Saudi Arabia and Israel. But you will see a more financial support. You will see a flow of further entrenched flow of money and arms to Saudi Arabia. To Israel. So I think these two, if a future Trump presidency will decide whether the IMEC will go through. And the main caveat and the most important caveat of this is how the war in Gaza ends or not will also define and will also shape the trajectory of a future connectivity project in the Middle East. So that's that. Now, does the Trump administration sort of continue his first in terms of your question on whether Trump administration will continue his unilateral and isolationist sort of policy, I think, especially towards U.S. allies, I think he's going to be driven by pragmatic conclusions. He's going to be driven by, his administration is going to look at what are the benefits and what are the disadvantages that we are having vis-a-vis a certain ally. If the Trump administration really thinks that a certain ally is drawing too much from the United States and giving less, I think the pressure on that ally is going to grow. And that's true for not just bilateral relationship, but also multilateral. Look at the NATO, the question of NATO. People are asking whether NATO will survive in a post Trump presidency, in a Trump presidency, in a post Biden presidency. The questions are real. And what happens to the alliances? So everything that Trump did, for example, the pullout from the JCPOA, leaving Iran where it is now, if JCPOA was still in shape, we could have a much better chance at peace in the Middle East than we have now. But if you come at America's other allies, for example, Japan and South Korea, both had been threatened by the Trump administration. Now, all of that created a lot of dissonance and a lot of mistrust in America's allies across the world. Now, the Biden administration prides itself on the fact that it has worked to discontinue or turn that around with America's allies in terms of assuring America's allies across the Atlantic and in the Pacific, and to create a robust Indo-Pacific strategy. But if a Trump presidency comes to office, I think expect a more unilateral, yes, isolationist, yes, but on specific issues. And I think it's going to be very practical in terms of dealing economically with countries like Japan and South Korea, and also the European partners. I think and those streaks are also visible, are not sort of exclusive to the United States. If you look at the European partners, some of these streaks are also available. For example, Macron's France tries to always carve a distinct path as opposed to America. So I think every country will try to look for its own ways. But in the case of Trump presidency, these trends will be amplified. Finally, I'll touch on your last question, and then I'll stop for any question or answer you might have. How will a Trump presidency address transnational challenges like terrorism, climate change, etc.? I think in terms of terrorism, expect a robust stand from a future Trump presidency. Expect more resilient counterterrorism networks. Expect more partnerships across the region, across the Middle East, as well as transatlantic allies. But a Trump presidency will always look at counterterrorism as a responsibility which should equally be carried out by its partners. So international cooperation and collaboration, both at the multilateral and the bilateral levels, will seek more from the partner countries in terms of counterterrorism. But I think Trump's stance vis-a-vis counterterrorism is supposed to be amplified, and I'm expecting that it will be more amplified when we enter a second Trump presidency, because terrorism is something that, but Trump's definition of terrorism ranges from university protests to actual terrorism. So, what he defines terrorism is also a question, and how he deals with that problem, right? He has also asked that he will expel everybody with jihadist sentiment from the United States. Now that he also categorizes that as terrorism. So we'll have to wait and see at how it plays out domestically, because now America has a lot of immigrant population, and how that plays out within the democratic politics of the United States. And on other issues, for example, gender rights, expect Trump to be very blunt. He's already announced that he will repeal all the laws which talks about gender equity and equality, and he will pass a resolution which will only have two genders, male and female. So the issue of transgender rights in the United States is a question under Trump, and we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. On the issue of climate change, we've already seen Trump's pull out from the Paris Climate Accord, and he's going to double down. He's also going to repeal some of the pollution acts that have been imposed by vehicle pollution act, some of that have been imposed by the Biden administration. So we're going to see a more drilling and fracking at home, because Biden administration put certain sanctions and put certain limitations, not sanctions, limitations on how much any state could drill for oil near their water or territory. Trump administration has already announced that if he comes to power, he's going to repeal some of these fracking and drilling acts so that it allows states to produce more oil in the United States, which means that he wants to dominate the energy world when he comes in. So I think I'll stop there in terms of how he will deal with other issues. But if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra. It was a very informative talk. Let me, as I inform you, let me ask a couple of more detailed questions. First of all, I want to know that in general and in the conclusion, which president, which candidate actually does India prefer? Can we say that India prefer Biden over Trump in general, or this is not a very accurate conclusion?
Very good question, but I think you will get the answer if you look at India's policies. Traditionally, it's been a strategic a country that practices strategic autonomy. It has been able to work with the Democrats and the Republicans on both sides of the aisle. So I don't think, as a nation state, India has a particular preference. I think there are challenges on either sides. For example, in the Biden administration, you have certain criticism of democracy in India, which India, of course, does not agree with. And in the case of Trump administration, you have issues on tariffs and trade and other practical issues. So I think both the administration will have its own challenges, and India, because India, it's a strong India caucus in the United States Congress. We are hopeful that any presidency India will be able to navigate equally well. So I don't think we have a state preference, or even in the most modest sense, I don't think we can outline any preference.
Thank you. Another related question is, do you think that a future deepening of tension between United States and China will naturally get India closer to the United States? Can India become an ally, as you distinguish the two terms, ally and partner? Can India become a US ally and somehow abandon its strategic autonomy?
I think the question of alliance has been probed quite a lot, and I think India has been blamed for being the weakest link and the slowest actor in institutions like the Quad. But I think it's missing the forest for the trees, essentially because India is not looking at the Indo-Pacific as a zero-sum game. So alliance is, of course, out of question. Now, the question to my mind is how strong a partnership with the US can grow to balance China in a future scenario where China becomes a threat. Now, of course, China and India are competing in the Asian space, and there is no denying the factor that both are large economies, civilizational states, and are competitors. But there's also a fact that we share border with China, right? America doesn't share border with China. We have the largest trading partner of India is China today. So I think it's a complicated relationship. We have a border dispute, which is actually going on. I mean, it's an active border dispute right now. So given all those complications, we cannot really, put all eggs in one basket and say that we are up for alliance. I think it's also because if a country, and from India's perspective, if a country is looking at becoming or transforming itself into a great power, then I think alliance takes a back seat. What takes the front seat is a vision. And I think that vision, increasing your capacity, increasing your regional capacity, increasing your self-reliance, and increasing technological capacities in the region become more important than alliance. And I think That's what India is looking at.
Thank you. What opportunities do you see in Asia for India if Trump comes?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
I said that. What opportunities do you see in?
I think I lost your. I can't hear you.
My microphone is off. Excuse me.
Yeah.
What opportunities do you see in Asia for India if Trump will come to power?
So, I mean, if Trump comes to power, you're seeing possibly a more bellicose U.S.-China relationship, right? You're seeing more. So, for example, the Biden administration imposed a lot of tariffs on on China on high-end technology. Now, that is a space where India has an advantage with relationship with reference to the relationship with the United States, because high-end tech, for example, robotics, AI, and critical minerals, these are issues that will drive the supply chain in the Indo-Pacific for the next for the next three decades. Therefore, if a fierce competition in a likely Trump presidency happens between US and China, you could see more companies shifting out of China and finding other places. And natural places for them would be Southeast Asia and India. Already, the glimpse of that you're seeing in terms of the transition that Apple has made. For example, Apple's in the last few years, Apple has shifted two major outlets out of China, and one in Southeast Asia, one in India. And you're seeing more companies do that. This is also concomitant with the rising labor wages in China, and that's also a factor why manufacturing is moving out of China. So I think in the next 5 years, in a likely Trump presidency, if you see, which is I'm expecting a more fierce US-China competition, it is likely that India may have some advantages vis-a-vis attracting more companies which want to come out of this competition and find a different place which is more suitable for the growth of their industries. So I think that is one, but it doesn't come without risks. And the most potent risk is that we are in an age where technology is driving everything. And if US China really go to a fierce technological war, I don't expect an actual combat happening, but I expect a more technological war happening. But if that happens with more cyber espionage, cyber attacks, and more AI-driven supply chain disruptions, in that case, I think India is as much to lose as any other country in this region. So I think it comes with both positives as well as risks.
Thank you. I would like to ask about the Indian-Pakistan disputes. Do you think that Trump will to which side he will?
Yeah, I got your question. I think which side will a Trump presidency possibly will take, or America will take? Pakistan has an interesting shift in the national discourse of India, from a country that actually drove its national security in many ways. At least the narratives around national security were driven by Pakistan as a strong factor. That has changed. Now, Pakistan has taken a backseat. I mean, if you talk to Indians on a normal national security discourse, Pakistan doesn't figure. Because largely what has done is the center has sort of managed the border in such a way that infiltration, etc., the terrorism continues, but I think it has been subdued to a large extent. The other point is that the economic gap between India and Pakistan is such that it is driving Pakistan to relegation, that we are not so much concerned about Pakistan as a national discourse. Today, India has more than 5 times the economy of Pakistan. So I think there is a lot of difference there. In terms of the US position on Pakistan versus India, I think you have seen a clear shift from the Clinton administration. The Bill Clinton administration was the first administration which actually told the Nawaz Sharif government in Pakistan that it will not side with Pakistan, and actually it's a bilateral dispute, which is a stand of India. India considers this as a bilateral dispute, of which Pakistan and India are actors which will solve, and it doesn't require any third country to sort of step in. And I think the Clinton administration since has sided with the idea that it's a bilateral dispute and America will keep a distance. But I think you have seen a shift of how America has engaged Pakistan across different presidencies. Under the Obama administration, you saw a strong relationship between US and Pakistan because they wanted to work on counterterrorism. They wanted Osama bin Laden, which they got. And I think if you look at the other administrations, for example, the Trump administration, on the first day of his office, Trump tweeted that enough of this, we will not be supportive to any terrorist ideas from Pakistan. I'm paraphrasing this, but it is roughly this. So Trump administration had a strong, least support for any state that had something to do with terrorism, and because in the idea of the United States and India both consider that Pakistan is a terror sponsor state, because we are both at the receiving end of Pakistan. And Iran is increasingly now facing that problem in the Balochistan region. And Iran had a missile exchange with Pakistan because there are certain groups festering in Pakistan as well, on the other side as well. So I think there is a problem of an ecosystem in Pakistan. But I think the Biden administration is more is sort of ignoring Pakistan, if I can use that word. But the Trump administration is likely to tighten the screws on Pakistan, and I don't see a great engagement between the two sides, unless, of course, it's on counterterrorism. On counterterrorism, because America has pulled out of Afghanistan, it needs a country, and that country can only be Pakistan. No other country they will find favorable support to host American troops than Pakistan. So I think on counterterrorism, you could see some cooperation between the two countries, but on other issues, I think you expect a more favorable stand to India when it comes to India-Pakistan dynamic.
Thank you. My other question is, you have mentioned anti-immigration approach in the Trump worldview. Do you think what role do you see for the Indian diaspora in the United States uh, ju- before the election and in the election and after the election in possible Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, Indian diaspora is a very strong and growing diaspora. So there were three waves of migration to the United States. The first was the Chinese, then the Japanese, and then, of course, the Japanese after the Second World War, and then you had the Chinese, and now you have the Indian wave of immigration. So as a result, you have seen more and more Indians go to the United States, studying for businesses, etc. That has driven a change in the American politics. Yes, Indian Americans were, until 5 to 7 years back, or at least a decade back, were seen to be more pro democratic presidents. But I think increasingly that has shifted. Now you're increasingly seeing that there is a rise of Hindu consolidation in the United States, and that is more favorable to the Republican Party. There is also a caucus. There's a Hindu caucus, which is led by Tulsi Gabbard, a politician in the US Congress. So I think you're seeing a more consolidated approach at the political level. The rise in percentage, I think it's around 1.7 to 1. If I'm not wrong, I think around 1%, 1 point something percent of the American population. But the voting percentage will actually be lesser than that. But still significant. So you see a shift in terms of how Indian Americans now vote. And they also Indian Americans are at the leadership positions, for example, in Google, Microsoft. All of these are being led. Many of these companies are being led. PepsiCo, for instance, was being led until recently by Indra Nooyi. Leadership-driven changes also impact voting patterns, and I think those will also impact voting patterns in how. But Indians, have. It's very difficult to predict which way they will go. So a large section of the votership has been transferred from the initially a pro-democratic to a more pro-Republican, and you're seeing that consolidation. You're seeing Trump as a the Indian diaspora also, quite a chunk of it sees Trump as a strong president. So I will not be surprised.
Thank you. Let me take the question of my colleague, Dr. Ali Salehian, who wrote two questions in the chat box. The first question is, do you consider the most important variable in upcoming election identical incentives or economical? Based on your experience to study in US and the polarization of their society.
Yeah, I mean, I see currently, as if you look at the US polarization, it is the identity. Economics, yes, but I think today what drives the American politics and is driving for at least since October 7th is the identity politics. Because increasingly, the war in Gaza has taken such a turn that now identity politics is driving American politics. So, for example, if you look at the Biden administration's statements initially, you see that they were driven by the fact that the Biden administration actually went and openly supported Israel. It continues to do, but a change has happened in the fact that it has tempered down its support for Israel. And has said that if for instance, if Israel decides to do a full-scale invasion of Gaza, or if Israel, in the case of Iran, when the missile attack happened, if that actually happened, then America will not be supporting Israel on a full-scale war. And that actually led to a very modest response from Israel after the missile exchange, which was in Isfahan in Iran. So I think you see a growing pressure on the Biden administration. And why is that change happening? That's only happening because of the identity crisis. People are wearing identity on their sleeves. There is a large section of immigrant population, and particularly from the Middle East, which have now moved to the US and are now voters. They impact the Democratic, and most of them are Democratic. Most of them vote for the Democratic Party. Now, that was supposed to change if Biden administration did not temper its support to Israel. So, but if the moment you saw that Biden started constructing a pier in Gaza for sending a floating pier in Gaza to send support, and also started dropping aid in Gaza, the poll numbers of Biden started increasing, right? So there is a direct connection between identity and the politics in the United States. And that's now much different than it used to be 10 years ago, simply because of the mix of population that has changed in the United States, simply because of the immigrant factor. It has changed considerably. So I think it's primarily identity and identical notions that drive America's politics today, or at least will drive America's politics in this election in November.
His second question is, how do you evaluate the role of establishment? Oh, my microphone is off. Excuse me. How do you evaluate the role of establishment or so-called deep state in the foreign policy of the US? There are experts who believe the role of the president is not very much in changing the grand strategy of the US.
See, I think deep state continues to play a role, but in the case of United States, my sense is, and I could be wrong, my sense is that deep state has always been an actor in terms of how the intelligence agencies have acted across countries, across the world, how for example, the CIA, how it has functioned in Latin America, how it has functioned in USSR and other countries. But I think to discount the role of the president would be a tad bit too much. The president continues to be a defining actor in the American politics. And so if you look at the Biden administration and look at the grand strategy of the US and evaluate and try to evaluate whether it has changed, I think the presidency plays a very important role. For example, in the case of Biden administration, it has brought down the mega infrastructure deal. It has brought down a major Chips and Sciences Act, which impact the export of high-end technology to China. So that has shaped the American grand strategy in the Indo-Pacific in a certain way. So I think presidential injunction, executive orders, and his office continues to be very important. Deep state plays a role, yes, but particularly the intelligence agencies and other bureaucratic sort of mechanisms of the United States, they continue to be subservient to the White House. And I think the State Department, White House, and the Pentagon, there are moments when each of these offices try to sort of circumvent the White House, but the White House has the ultimate say. In the case of the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he had a cancerous treatment and he did not inform the White House, so he did circumvent, and apparently the Pentagon was without the chief for about 3 days, 2.5, 3 days. So people would say that there are moments when other arms of American executive and bureaucracy try to overrun the White House. It does happen, but I think eventually the final word still lies with the president, and that is going to grow with the Trump presidency, because he wants power in his own hand. He acts as if everything is driven by his pen, unlike Biden, where he cuts slack in his office.
Thank you. I agree with that. And also his third question that there are studies who categorize countries such as India uh, and Trump American as an axis of nationalists. Do you agree with that? The similarities between ideologies in two countries.
So not really. I mean, if you look at the Republican Party's politics and if you look at the BJP Party's politics, yeah, they're completely different. They harp on different ideologies. But to the extent that both are right-wing conservative parties, yes, there's a great alignment. And I think it's not just exclusive to America and India relations. It's exclusive to world over. World over, you've seen the rise of the right, which is a term which is used for rise of conservative parties across Europe. You see in Germany, you see in Poland, you see all across countries where you see in Hungary, you have in Brazil, you had Jair Bolsonaro before this. So across the world, there is a consolidation of conservative views, which is a reaction to the liberal order and the repercussions of the liberal order, which have sort of perpetuated for a long time. Iran, I mean, you would know, sitting in Tehran, you would know better when in 1979 the revolution happened. So there is a way in which civilizations, ideologies, and administrations sort of try to come back from a position and try to change that position which has been there for a long time. And I think it is that phase where the world is seeing the rise of the right, where across countries there's a consolidation of conservative views.
Thank you. Let me just ask two more questions directly related to the topic of the session, but indirectly related, excuse me, but directly related to the situation in Iran. The first question is, according to our talks, our discussions with your Indian colleagues, we knew that the India's failure in investment in Chabahar, the recent agreement that has been signed, the reason for not investing in Chabahar is somehow, if we can be frank, is over compliance with U.S. Sanctions. How do you think that re-election of Trump will affect this U.S. factor in India and Iran relation? And the last question is, how do you predict the Iran-U.S. relations in the second possible Trump administration? Thank you.
Thank you for the great questions. On the first, I think the Chabahar problem. I mean, India had, of course, because given the structural constraints of India-US relations, and by that I mean that the foundational agreements that we have signed with the United States, the SISMOA, the LEMA, the BECA, the geospatial agreement, the GISMOA, these are agreements which have taken our relationship a notch higher and made and sort of landed it between a friend and an ally. So it is a very special relationship with the United States, particularly in the case of defense. But it comes with its own constraints. And those constraints are that being a partner with the United States also makes sure the United States will make sure that there is some end use monitoring. And that is not so even in our, and as you know, India is a strong defense partner of Russia, right? I mean, we have a lot of defense dependence on Russia. We run into the same problem with Russia as well. I mean, we have a strong relationship with the US where the US wants to see end use monitoring, where there is interoperability becomes a problem because we have an American system and we have a Russian system, and the Americans don't want the Russian systems to be merged, and vice versa. So I think those problems continue. For India, the challenge is to thread that incredibly thin needle, which is to sort of, in the case of Chabahar, the one of the main reasons why it stopped in the first place was the steel, the sanctions on steel, and the necessity of those steel to make the first layer of the Chabahar port. And I think the companies that we sort of zeroed down, both Iran and India, on buying some of these steel, were faced with American sanctions, so we did not go ahead with it. But right now, I think if we start with in a Trump presidency, you could expect these sanctions to continue. I expect that the Biden administration has recently, as somebody asked this question, and the Biden administration said that sanctions are in place, and therefore, any country that deals with Iran will face these sanctions. But I think on the steel itself, we are trying to circumvent that. If my knowledge is correct, we're trying to circumvent that issue and deal with that later. But I think in the port management issue itself, and we will focus more on areas that does not require imports that have sanctions from America. So I think, for example, if we start with port management, that doesn't impact either Iran or India in terms of how sanctions are cast. So I think we should, in India and Iran may have a plan, which I'm not aware of, but I think to be starting with management may be a better issue in terms of how to manage the American sanctions. But in the case of Trump, I see American sanctions perhaps growing on Iran, but not particular to Chabahar. I don't think it will be particular to Chabahar, but it could be in general to Iran, given what's going on, given if they decide to increase support to Israel that way. On your last question on how the U.S.-Israel relationship is likely to go in the case of Trump presidency, I think it's if you take some of the lessons, you want to say something?
I said US Iran.
Oh, U.S.-Iran relations. Sorry, U.S.-Iran relations. If you take some of the lessons from the past Trump presidency, killing of General Soleimani, and recently Israel's attack and Israel's taking out of one of the higher generals of Iran, and America's America's restraint. So all in all, the Biden administration has shown some restraint, because when Israel decided that it will respond to Iran, they had a direct communication from Washington that it should not be a regional war. I don't think under a Trump presidency you will have that restraint. Trump presidency is going to go out of the orbit and going to perhaps let Israel take a call. I think that is going to be a difference between Trump presidency, because it's an unhinged presidency. So for example, it also depends on ground realities. If Saudi Arabia, for instance, has conveyed Trump a future Trump presidency that it will sign the connectivity agreement, then you could see a pressure from Trump presidency to restrain Israel. So between US and Iran, I don't see the JCPOA coming back. I think I had a lot of hope in the initial years of the Biden administration. I was indeed expecting that the JCPOA will happen and there will be larger peace and stability in the region. But if the Biden administration could not do it, I don't think the Trump administration will be able to do it or will be keen to do it. And given Trump's tendencies and policies given by his going by his campaign speeches, it is going to be more supportive to Israel, and that will be that will sort of drive a wedge further between Iran and the United States. So I think that's my prediction, but I'll be happy to be proven wrong.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra, for your time and for great points that you have mentioned. It was a very informative talk.
Thank you, Dr. Hafiz. Please share the link of the video so that I can share it across my network.
Of course, sure. I wish we can meet in Tehran in person in the future. If you will,
I do hope to come someday. Yes.
I will be honored to host you in the think tank, in our think tank. I wish you a very happy and nice day.
Thank you. I wish you the same, and I wish all the listeners for a very good day. And thank you for your patience. It's been more than 1 hour, so thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye. Namaste.
Bye.